So my presentation is going to focus around the work that I'm doing now, which is through moving archetypes. And that is really about using dance and archetypes as a contemplative space. And hopefully during my talk, it might become a bit more meaningful as to why I do this and how does it make sense. Perhaps it doesn't. But then, a lot of archetypal spaces are about challenging notions about sense and convention and the right and the wrong. So perhaps, that's okay for me to do things which might appear to be meaningless as well. So I draw on the work of Carl Jung and James Hillman, which informs part of my approaches and the way I look at my practice and manifest it. Before I start, of course, as I'm doing dance, I'm talking about it from the embodied creative aspect in both Western and Eastern traditions. And I just want to kind of reflect on the fact that they're very different things. The idea of creativity is not universal. And there's a beautiful work done by the Indian psychoanalyst Sudhir Kakar, where he actually talks about how creativity is seen in India and how it's different to Western or even other Asian ideas about creativity. So in India, creativity is not a question about self-expression necessarily, but it is something that is subsumed to a larger goal, which is really about getting rid of the self, or the idea of ahamkara, aham, which is the selfhood. Because the idea in the philosophy is that it is ahamkara, or the idea of selfhood, that actually prevents you from becoming one with the bigger consciousness or the supreme consciousness. So creativity is about the more deep you are in your practice, the more space you have. I don't know if that makes sense, but the more deep you are in your practice, the more space you have. And that expression, because it's such a rare space, that expression in itself is not ordinary. It'll be unique, because not everybody is able to inhabit that space or go through that pathway. So that is the Eastern idea of creativity, or the Indian idea anyway, which you can see is quite different, even to the way in which Jung and Hillman use creativity when they talk about archetypal spaces and engaging with emotions. I also want to say that it's quite a personal perspective. I'm reflecting on my observations, on things that I've learned, in my practice. So again, I'll be very open to your reflections and your thoughts. I come from the Indian tradition, so obviously I have a bit of an outsider's view on Jung's work, even though I love it and it resonates with me, but I am an outsider to it. I'm much more of an insider to the Indian theater traditions and philosophical traditions. But if I take a sweeping view of Indian philosophy, I would actually divide it into two big sort of branches, I suppose, and Richard might challenge me on this, but I would say that there's the tantric modes where the body and creativity and arts practices are quite central, and then there is a lot of other philosophical streams which include Vedanta, where the intellect and an intellectual quest, logic in Indian terms, which is very different to how we understand logic in the West, where these ideas are explored. So in Indian philosophy, the idea of supreme consciousness, or the Brahman, is actually manifest through archetypes, because this idea is so difficult to comprehend and so abstract that they use in Sanskrit the word neti neti, which means you can only say it is not that, it is not that. But that is the only way to understand it, is in what it is not rather than what it is. So the way in which the Brahman is manifest is through archetypes. And so you have archetypes such as Rudra, the tantric goddesses, Vishnu, which represent different aspects of the Brahman. And the other important thing about Indian thinking around this is that where in Jung the realms of the consciousness, he would call it unconscious. In India, actually, that is the more real aspect. That is reality. The Brahman is reality. And everything, the material reality we live in is what is not real. So it is part of the Brahman, but it is not real in itself. So you can see that there's a complete flipping of the terminology. So I myself get confused when I go between, talking about the unconscious in Jung, but then when I come to the Indian aspect of it, it is actually consciousness or the Brahman. And the consciousness enjoys very different status in both Indian thought and in the West. In India, the idea of the Brahman as the reality is quite prevalent. I'm not saying that Indians aren't material. We are going to overtake everyone else in the world in our materiality. But there is still the idea of the Brahman is not, it's not strange, it's not marginal. It's a very central concept in the philosophy. It's my observation that in the West, when we talk about consciousness, it's a very marginal thing, that people are a bit skeptical about it. Even though I think in very recent works, especially in the scientific research around near-death experiences, that idea of the consciousness is becoming a little bit more prevalent, but it's happening quite slowly, as some of the people working in that area themselves would say. And the other thing that I observe is that where you talk about engaging with the consciousness, I think perhaps not Jung directly, I think he probably locates it more in neuroses, but Hillman uses the terminology of pathology to describe these experiences. Although he does say that rather than kind of think of it as something that's negative or something not to be had, it is an experience which is a symptom of the need for repairing a soul back into a new wholeness. So for me, what I observe in the West is that in the Western world, one of the most prevalent manifestations of consciousness is of an individual who is different, and in some ways they access pathological myths. So it could be childhood suffering or some kind of social inadequacies, etc., in order to assert the individuation process. This also, for me anyway, seems to reflect that more individual-centered aspect of Western psychology. And whereas, as I said before, within Indian philosophy, the idea is about subsuming your selfhood. So the ahamkara is subsumed. And I think Sudhir Kakar said that it's a difference between the spirit and the psyche, and both systems, both worlds deal with both these things, but one prioritizes the spirit, which is, I think, in the Indian thinking, the spirit becomes quite fundamental. So the whole process is about the spirit. And in Jungian thinking and Hillman, it seems to me, while the spirit is quite present, it's more about the psyche than the spirit. And I'm very happy to be, if I can get some people who might think differently, I'll be very happy to hear those views. So the notion of Brahman as a reality in Indian thought gives consciousness a primacy, as I said, which it still struggles to attain in Western thinking. By the same token, when Indian philosophy is kind of transported into the West, it also becomes a non-real philosophy. There is a sense where if you're not coming from within that tradition, it's reinterpreted in the West as something that is an escape from reality. It's kind of otherworldly, or completely the opposite. Let's use this to have a good life in this world. But essentially, I think it's neither one nor the other. And I think that's what happens when you have two systems that might seem similar, but they are quite significantly different. So since the Brahman is beyond language and understanding, as long as we are living in the material realm, Indian thought has a rich pantheon of archetypes, and each of them challenge the assumptions by which we inhabit Maya or this reality. So Maya is described as duality, a constructed fantasy of our minds, which consists of buddhi, which is the intellect, and the mind. So in Indian thought, the intellect isn't above this reality. It's all part of this material reality. And Maya is described as being one of likes and dislikes. So we inhabit this reality, and it's really constructed out of likes and dislikes, fundamentally. The field of the Brahman, the source, can only be understood in the Maya realm, as I said, through the archetypes. And so these archetypes, in the Indian tradition anyway, they are a pathway to subsuming yourself. So on the one hand, they kind of unite the Maya, but I would call it more a subsuming of the Maya reality within the larger Brahman. So that's the main role of the archetypes in the Indian archetypal traditions. And in the Jungian thinking and in Hillman's thinking, archetypes play either a role of expressing that connection between the unconscious and the conscious, or they help in an integration process.